We even have people in the spillover room watching by closed circuit TV, unless they switch channels and are watching the Mueller hearings. But we have a really good program today. But before we get to that, as is our wont, I wanted to remind you of upcoming speaker series talks. July 31st, next week, there'll be a talk by Sarah Anzia from UC Berkeley on the pension crisis in the public sector, particularly focusing on California. The following week, for those who are interested in water, and I'm sure many of you are, there is a kind of a special focused look involving a case study about the Santa Ana watershed, applying anthropologic methods to understand some of these complex nexi between scientific issues and ecological issues and social issues. And then 1 week following, of course, is our quarterly undergraduate research showcase, so we hope all of you can come and see some of the great research projects that our undergraduate students have been doing while they're here at UCCS. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce Jonathan London. Jonathan is an associate professor, probably soon to be full professor in the Department of Ecology at UC Davis. He's been a wonderful colleague and friend of the UC Center Sacramento. He directs the Center for Regional Change at UC Davis. Jonathan obtained his PhD degree in environmental science, policy, and management from UC Berkeley, and then spent 5 years in the nonprofit sector working with an organization called Youth in Focus, where he obtained a lot of important real-world experience, which he now has been able to come and share with our academic community at UC Davis over the past decade or more. So in any case, it's with great anticipation that we look forward to your talk on water-related issues in the Central Valley in California. So Jonathan London.
Hey, well, good afternoon, everyone. Just opening up my water source since I'm talking about water today. It's really great to be here, and I do promise not to answer your questions as Senator. I do not recall, because that is a different show. So I am going to be talking about water justice in the San Joaquin Valley with a focus on disadvantaged unincorporated communities, and I'll talk about what a DUC is and how it's relevant to the state of the world around us. So I start with a slide that people often put at the end of their presentations, but I'm putting up front because this really was a collaborative effort, including, I think, at least a couple people here in the room. I saw Colin Bailey on the list from Environmental Justice Coalition for Water. So we had a really interdisciplinary team of researchers from UC Davis and worked with a number of water justice organizations, bringing a really wide variety of areas of expertise together, and we're fortunate also to work with support from Water Foundation and Resources Legacy Fund. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a broad framework of the human right to water and how that is a broad framework for the study that we're doing. To go into a little bit of background about what is a disadvantaged unincorporated community, and then particularly focus on our report on water justice in the San Joaquin Valley, and close out with some recommendations that come from our report and relate to a number of the issues that are happening all around us now, including recent passage of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. So as that kind of framework for water justice that I mentioned is the human right to water, which a number of you know a lot about, I'm sure, being from some of the key agencies that are working on that. So this was a policy passed in 2012, which now is part of the California Water Code, and it recognizes access to water not just as a commodity or just as a service, but truly as a human right. Something that we literally can't survive without and needs to be recognized in this fundamental way. And that is access to drinking water and sanitation water for all of our basic daily functions. And that has a number of different components to it. I won't go through all of the details here. I know that the slides will be up on the website, so you can look in more detail. But the human right to water has components around drinking water quantity and accessibility, abundance. It has an element about quality and safety and cleanliness, and then it has an element on affordability. And our study looked particularly at the quality and quantity. There's a number of really important studies that are also looking at affordability. So a little bit of background on disadvantaged unincorporated communities, or DUCs. So these are places, first, that are disadvantaged. So that means that their income is less than 80% of the state's median household income, MHI. So they're low income. They're also unincorporated. So that means that they are outside of a city limit. So they don't have access to direct representation by a city. They often don't have access to infrastructure, which I'll talk about in the next moment. And they are, there we go. And then they also, because they don't have that kind of municipal power, taxation power, and so on, are often lacking in a lot of the areas of infrastructure that many of us take for granted, including drinking water, but also things like sewers and gutters and sidewalks and streetlights, as well as other kinds of resources like grocery stores and things like that. They also tend to be inhabited by communities of color, as well as being low income in the San Joaquin Valley. Often those are farm working communities and other occupations. It's really important, and we spent some time in the report looking at the historical legacies that produced this inequitable landscape. And that has a number of different kind of historical scales to it. And we really want to show how this is not just an accident that some places are disadvantaged and unincorporated, but that really has a great historical basis. So we start that narrative with the genocide against Native Americans throughout the entire state of California, including in the San Joaquin Valley. That really drastically changed, of course, the cultural, political elements of those communities, as well as the ecological dimensions of that landscape. There's been then successive generations of immigration to California as a whole and the San Joaquin Valley from all around the world, often recruited to be low income and considered sort of docile labor that when it gets to a certain point, they're seen as threats or others to the mainstream society and then excluded in some way. So that story can be grounded in Chinese immigration in the 1800s with the railroads and agriculture here in the Sacramento area, as well as San Joaquin Valley, until the ideas of the yellow peril became so powerful that they were excluded from land ownership and citizenship, and in favor of other ethnic groups like the Japanese, who took over a lot of that agricultural basis until they were then seen as enemies of the state in World War II, in turn losing a significant amount of their land and their agricultural base. There's also, of course, the largely white migration of immigrants from the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma and Texas, the central south of the United States, immortalized by Grapes of Wrath, one of my favorite books. If you haven't read it, you really should read it. It's fantastic. You can even read it every couple years, and you always see something new. But anyway, a key part of California history, so it's not only just a racial and ethnic component, it also has a strong class component. There's also a somewhat less familiar story of African American migration into the San Joaquin Valley, drawn from escaping the Reconstruction South after the Civil War, then escaping the Jim Crow South, starting in the early part of this or last century, and settling in a number of agricultural colonies throughout the San Joaquin Valley. There, of course, course, is the immigration story that is probably a lot more familiar to a lot of people, of the Bracero labor program, bringing Mexican immigrants to work in agriculture starting in about World War II through the mid-1960s, and of course many settling and staying today and giving rise to a strong and vibrant and crucial part of the state's ethnic mosaic. So there's this kind of ethnic and racial othering, as I talked about, of groups being brought in to get value from their labor, but also excluded from the benefits of the society. So some of that came from racially restrictive land ownership in cities and in rural areas, some from legalized at the time segregation through racially restrictive covenants in land ownership, and the exclusion of people, therefore, from cities and pushing to the fringes of those of the municipal areas, as well as long-term labor settlements that then became more regularized into the communities that we have today. So that real important element of that, the landscape we're looking at today is not just a historical accident. It is the product of, in many cases, intentional decisions that have been made over time, and even when they're not necessarily intentional, they are structural and systemic. And if we're going to be solving the problems through policy fixes now, we need to be taking into account that longer history. So that kind of broad history that I laid out has come into the planning realm through policies in things like general plans for cities and counties. So one marked and really notorious plan was the 1971 general plan in Tulare County that looked at these unincorporated communities as non-viable, as places that were not seen as having an authentic future, and therefore should be starved from infrastructure investments, with the idea that they could go through a natural decline and somehow people would disappear and go somewhere else, but the counties would not be investing in these kinds of communities in the future. People didn't just disappear. They were committed to place, but places that did not have sufficient infrastructure, and until very recently, and in some cases continuing now, that infrastructure is not available to them. So in that landscape, in that political, historical, cultural framework, our study was really trying to understand what is the characteristic today of these disadvantaged unincorporated communities. How does the hydrologic landscape, sort of the policy infrastructure landscape, provide an equitable set and availability of resources, and how are these playing out in access to clean drinking water, as well as what are the kinds of things that can be done to be able to change and reshape and re-envision that kind of inequitable landscape? What are the different kinds of policy mechanisms that can be useful to make those kinds of changes? So we used a wide variety of data, and for time's sake, I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail in presenting it now, but I'd be happy to, in Q&A, go into more detail, and afterwards, if you want to nerd out together, we could definitely do that, because I love to do that kind of thing. But we used a really wide variety of data to get a comprehensive and holistic look at what was going on in these kinds of communities, and then did a number of spatial analyses to look at, where the DUCs are, where the boundaries of the public and community water systems are, what's the characteristic of that spatial relationship, and how, therefore, are different kinds of solutions to be able to connect those places without adequate drinking water to the kinds of water systems that would be able to provide that human right to water. So what did we find? So we mapped out, as I said, where these DUCs are and where the public water systems are. as a first round. So in this map, you have the areas that are in the lightest blue circles are not overlapped at all by a public water system. So they're on, presumably they're on private or domestic wells. And I'll give you some of the numbers of what that looks like in a moment. The places that are in the sort of mid-shade of blue are partially overlapped by a public water system. So that may or may not be providing to individual households in that DUC, may or may not be providing piped water. Unless you sort of draw out the specific access pipes, we didn't have access to those data. So all we knew is that the polygon of the DUC and the water system only partially overlapped. So there was more than likely places that weren't being supplied by a water system in their own homes. And then there are places that are fully overlapped by a water system, not necessarily providing clean and safe drinking water, but at least providing water. So what does that look like? So within the San Joaquin Valley, about 350,000 people live in a DUC, and there are about 450 of those DUCs throughout the region. There are, to say, about 71% actually do live within a community water system boundary. So that's about almost 250,000. About 21% may not be served because they're only partially overlapped, and another 8%, which is about 27,000 people, live outside of a water system boundary as a whole. So there's this really uneven, and you could say inequitable, landscape in terms of distribution of who is getting access to these kinds of served systems. One thing that's really important to know is even the places that are served by a community water system, they look really differently across the different kinds of communities. So in DUCs, there are, the vast majority of those are served, which is here and here, are served by small systems, under 200 connections. And that's really important. That's really important because the small systems are often lacking the kinds of financial and technical infrastructure to be able to maintain high quality water and sustain that over time. The majority of those small systems are often also private systems. So there's issues of direct access to decision making in those areas, and that starts to change with the larger systems that become a greater degree of those are public or either municipal or mutual water systems. So that's kind of where the water is. So now we want to know what about the quality of the water that's being provided. So we mapped out where the systems that are providing water that is not up to compliant standards, state drinking water quality standards. So the areas in the circles in red are the community water systems that are out of compliance with those water regulations. The places that are in gray circles are those that, at the time of our study, had an unknown status. So there wasn't adequate information to know whether they were in or out. We could make some assumptions, but they would only be assumptions that places that weren't reporting may not have the infrastructure to be able to be doing that kind of consistent reporting. But again, we don't know, so we just have those as status unknown. But you can kind of see a pattern here of smaller, more rural communities in which these systems are not providing in compliance water. So for these that are out of compliance, there's about 1 in 4 of those systems are providing unsafe drinking water to their residents. And as I mentioned a little bit before, about 27,000 people are not being served at all. And because the underlying groundwater in many cases is contaminated by a number of different contaminants, and I'll talk about a little bit of what those are. And they also, in many cases, are low-income people, so it's more than likely that they're having either untreated water or very limited treatment, sort of point-of-use treatment. and so may very well be drinking that contaminated water. There need to be more specific site-to-site kinds of analysis to know specifically what the drinking water vulnerability is, and there are other studies that are happening right now that are looking at that question. And I mentioned that most of the drinking water systems that are out of compliance are in small systems, and the majority of those small systems are serving the DUC. So that's the kind of connection there. So the different kind of water problems, as I mentioned, are a factor of a number of different kinds of systems. So because a lot of these areas are in significant the agricultural belt of our state, the kind of heartland of our state, there are a number of different contaminants coming from those production systems, like nitrates that are from fertilizers, as well as animal manure, cow manure mostly, as well as things that in some cases are naturally occurring, like arsenic and uranium, but if there's inadequate treatment, those kinds of contaminants are coming out of the tap. Arsenic is also an industrial byproduct, so there's both naturally occurring and an industrial basis. There's pesticides, there's industrial contaminants like 1,2,3-TCP and others. There's also issues of quantity. So in a lot of these DUCs, particularly in the drought, there was inadequate water supplies, and in some cases the wells were going dry entirely. And then although our study didn't do empirical work on affordability, it's important to look at that as part of this sort of triple bottom line of water inequity. So people are bearing a triple cost. Those who are most unable to bear that cost are those that are bearing the heaviest cost. So that cost is high water rates to be able to deal with deferred maintenance on these systems. There is then the cost of people buying replacement water, since they're not wanting to drink what they're increasingly understanding as contaminated water, so they're buying bottled water. In some cases there's trucked water, but mostly people are replacing with relatively high cost bottled water. And then there are the unknown or difficult to measure health costs of chronic exposures to these kinds of contaminants in the water that range from developmental impacts to cancers to other kinds of health effects. So this is also a racial and ethnic story, a quality, as I mentioned, in that sort of deeper legacy of othering and of racial and ethnic disparities plays out in the case of drinking water as well. So while Latinos or Hispanics are just under half of the population of the San Joaquin Valley, they are 68% of the DUC residents, so disproportionately located in disadvantaged and unincorporated areas. There are also 63% of DUC residents in rural areas and 66% of city residents that are getting unsafe drinking water. And there are 64% of the DUC residents that are not being served by any kind of water system. So you can see by the numbers, there's this kind of inequitable landscape. So one of the things that we found unexpectedly and with great excitement and a sense of optimism was that although there are all these problems, which I spent a half hour laying out and hopefully not depressing you too much, is that drinking water that is safe is actually relatively close at hand to many of these DUCs. So this map shows in the sort of darkest red the DUCs that are within 500 feet of an existing community water system that either is providing or could provide safe drinking water. Those that are sort of in this pinkish color are between 500 feet and a mile. Those in the darker yellow are between 1 and 3 miles, and the lightest shade there is over 3 miles. So what does that look like in terms of the measurement? So we use two different kinds of techniques, of spatial techniques. So one was just looking at sort of from the center of a DUC to the center of a community water system, what was that distance? And then the other way was doing what we called a least cost path analysis. So looking at from where the DUC and the drinking water system is, what's the kind of alignment that if you were to extend pipe would go on? Is there a big road? Is there a smaller road? Do you have to pass a river? You have to go through undeveloped land? So you could understand not just the physical distance, but the feasibility. We didn't do literal cost feasibility, but to give a sense categorically about what are the different types of spatial relations between places that need water and places that have water. And I'll talk a little bit about the case of East Porterville in a moment, actually. So with that least cost path analysis, we found that 67% of the DUCs are within 500 feet of a drinking water system, and I'll show you that a little bit more easily in words. So again, 350,000 residents. So 44% of those DUC residents are within 500 feet, so that's about 65,000 people. Another 22% live within a mile, so that's another 32,000, 33,000 residents. 33% live beyond 3 miles. So within a mile, you have 66%, and that's a big number. And it really shows that getting access to safe drinking water is not just a physical. It's not a physical impossibility. The lack of access is not just because these are these far-flung places that really can't be connected up with an existing community water system. In fact, safe drinking water is close at hand, and with proper investment of financial capital as well as political capital, these kinds of places really can achieve and maintain that human right to water. So as one example, the city of Porterville and the DUC of East Porterville were part of a really innovative arrangement that connected homes through laying of additional pipe to community that had actually, where the wells had actually gone dry, and they were they were hauling in water as well as providing drinking water in bottles. Before talking about the specific solutions, just to kind of point your attention to this spatial dimension. So you have the city of Porterville that looks, if you're into sci-fi like I am, kind of like a dragon that's eating East Porterville. You can kind of see that. But in fact, it's not eating it at all. It's excluding it. Over time, you have the growth patterns of cities like Porterville. Modesto is a really famous case of this, of selective annexation. So you have cities that are growing into areas that are either undeveloped and that are going to be for sort of high-income residents, or for connecting to places where there are existing neighborhoods with generally higher-income people, often white people, and excluding lower-income areas and areas where there's a predominance of people of color, like East Porterville. So you have these really bizarre shaped cities, and that is exemplified here by East Porterville. So these DUCs were on dry wells, as I mentioned, as well as contaminated wells at this time. And in the face of this, groups like Community Water Center and others, Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, Environmental Justice Coalition for Water, other groups in the water justice arena worked with local leaders in East Porterville and advocated for a solution to be able to get water connected in. And this was, as I mentioned, this was the problem of lack of access in getting emergency systems. And so as a more sustainable system, they created this extraterritorial service agreement. So basically laying pipe and connecting homes in East Porterville with the municipal water system in Porterville and getting access to safe drinking water, and again, really helping to recognize and exemplify and meet this human right to water. So as one example, that's great. But how do we create this as a systemic and scalable solution? So we came up with a number of recommendations. I'll talk about all 5 briefly, and then I'll go into 3 in more detail. So the first is to enforce existing policies around systems consolidation and annexation. So with areas where there is an existing system, whether that's a municipal system or another community water system, near a small system that is potentially failing or providing inconsistent water, that there can be policy implementation and enforcement to compel the annexation and consolidation of those systems together. There's also a set of recommendations around the municipal boundaries and annexation of unincorporated areas by cities, and the ways that cities can be brought to take unincorporated communities' interest in mind as they're doing their annexation. That there can be expanded funding, and I'll talk more about this, and probably a lot of people in this room know about the passage of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund that had been a prize, eyes on the prize for many years, and finally now passed in the last couple weeks. Then I had a couple recommendations about the data pieces, about having the state agencies integrate the different kinds of water data systems, and then potentially expanding our study or expanding the realm of studies to be able to deal with a lot of other issues, like looking at sanitation or looking at private domestic wells and others that other researchers are taking up. So just to go into a little bit more detail on those top 3 about enforcement of existing laws. So one kind of overarching piece is that while there's important work to be done with looking at existing water systems, there also are all of these places that are not being served at all or are being served by inadequate systems. And so there really needs to be a particular focus on these areas that are further spread and are not connected in with this sort of water ecosystem. Some of that can be done through like the State Water Quality Control Board or water boards, policy frameworks under things like Senate Bill 88 and its update with 522 and 1263 to have those consolidation mandates for these smaller systems, that larger systems as they're expanding or otherwise developing, that they need to be able to prioritize the consolidation with those smaller systems that, again, may not be providing adequate water supplies. So that's kind of like this top-down approach of the agencies compelling the local jurisdictions and water systems to create this kind of consolidated system. There's also the bottom-up component of communities being able to petition the water boards to be able to have their system incorporated and consolidated with these larger and better resourced and higher functioning systems. And then really looking at what are the different kinds of incentives as well as mandates for water systems from the state to lead to greater treatment and greater attention to the needs of these DUCs. For places that truly are far flung and are not going to be able to be consolidated, there's other kinds of non-physical consolidation, managerial consolidations, where you can get a sort of benefits of scale and sort of shared infrastructure, shared management infrastructure, shared administrative infrastructure to be able to provide these kinds of services at a lower cost. So in addition to the water systems themselves, I wonder where this came from, by the way. Hopefully not from one of these DUCs. So there's also the land use dimension of this. So there's policies like SB 244 that mandate when cities and counties are developing their general plans that the DUCs and just unincorporated communities and just disadvantaged communities, that their needs are taken into account, and that these kinds of longer historical legacies, which I'll talk about in a moment, are addressed. There's also the work of LAFCO, the local agency formation commissions, that are working on issues when cities are looking to annex other areas, that they need to take DUCs into account so you don't get those really strange shapes, kind of contorted city boundary shapes. And as I mentioned, that it's not just the current situation that needs to be addressed, but these longer legacies that are also being taken into account. And so, for example, there may be sort of a specific current day economic argument of saying, like, well, these places, they have lower income people, they're not going to be able to pay sufficient rates, and so we can't afford to do that. And that's kind of one market-based way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that there's a moral obligation to be able to serve all the people in your area, and particularly if you think about drinking water, in this case, as a human right, not just as the basis of an economic logic, that extending those kinds of services and service boundaries is the right thing to do, and is something that state policy ought to be incentivizing, and in some cases, as necessary, mandating. And so, as I mentioned, this was a really important recommendation, and now is a really important victory to revel in, is the passage of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. At this point when we did this study a year ago, that wasn't the case. It was a key priority for the campaign. So one of the key elements with funding is that it needs to not just be about buying new infrastructure, new treatment plants, but also to be able to have funding for ongoing operation and management. And you think that makes a lot of sense. If you're doing investment, you don't want to just sort of buy the car. You also want to be able to have a service plan. But unfortunately, in a lot of the because of different kinds of policy limitations, those funds have really just been used, or been able to be used, just for new infrastructure. So classic case that people may be familiar with is the arsenic treatment plant in Lanier, which was bought at significant cost, many millions of dollars. After 6 months, it had to shut down because it didn't have adequate O&M, operation and management, or maintenance funding, and people are still paying off the bonds, but don't have access to clean drinking water even after all that investment. So having access to the O&M funds is crucial. There also needs to be not just a sense of that there is resources out there, but that can be actually accessible to the DUCs themselves, that often don't have the upfront costs, or they don't have the upfront funds to be able to pay the costs for, like, engineering studies, feasibility studies, things that are in the grant application requirements, are often the groups that are least likely to be able to have those sorts of capacities to be able to get those sorts of funds. So being able to prime the pump, so to speak, and to be able to have communities that are most disadvantaged be able to have the capacity to be able to access those funds as they become available. As I mentioned, these ideas have now been put into action through the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund, coming from Senator Monning in the Senate and Assemblymember Garcia in the Assembly, and that again is a tremendous testament both to the legislature and to the water justice groups who've been working on that for numbers of years. So with that, I will close the formal presentation. Thank you. And I will look forward to questions. Looks like there